Now this took place some time ago, back when these mountains over here to the west of me had little hollers all over 'em. Back before the mining companies came in, sure made a big mess of things. Back when a family could make do for themselves if they knew how to work hard. So just over these peaks here, just over these peaks west of me, behind those peaks, there was a little cabin where a boy named Jack lived. Now Jack lived with his mom and his two older brothers, Will and Tom. Jack's daddy had been missing for some time. Nobody knew where he went. Some thought he died in the war or just disappeared while he was out hunting one day. Some say he ran off with some city girl that was passing by for a better life in the city. But whatever the case may be, Jack's daddy hadn't been around. So Will and Tom, they'd gone into town and got a couple jobs for themselves just to help their mama out with the money and keeping the homestead going. Jack, he was too young to work, so he would help his mom with all the chores. She needed him anyway, so he'd follow her around, doing the washing, helping with the cooking, the livestock, and all of that. Jack didn't mind the chores too much. He didn't love them, but he didn't mind them. Well, one day, Will and Tom, they'd come back from their job, and they were all excited. They were just plucking like some crazy chickens, going on and on and on. Well, Jack asked them what they were all excited about. And they told Jack that King had put up a reward, $1,000 for anyone who could bring him the most of these tiny little mushrooms. Now, King wasn't actually a king. There were no kings in these parts at that time, but he might have well have been. He was the richest man in the world as far as anyone knew. He had a big old mansion on the highest peak, had a bunch of land everywhere, and a lot of very successful business endeavors down in town. He owned the sawmill that Will and Tom worked at, which is why they heard of this thing. Now King was putting on a big feast, big old fancy feast for all his rich friends. And he wanted these tiny little mushrooms. Now the mushrooms, they grew all over the place, but they were so small they were hard to tell from a pebble or from a little roly-poly that rolled up in a ball because you were poking around. And well, everyone that had gone hunting for those mushrooms and were eating them has a story or two about eating a roly-poly. So Will and Tom, they got to thinking, how are they going to harvest so many of these mushrooms? There's got to be some kind of contraption or something they can do to get more than anybody else out there. So they went out into the barn and they got to thinking and studying and tinkering with things. Well, Will, he came up with a real good idea. He took an old rusty plow and kind of fixed it up a little bit and put it to a little cart, hooked it up to his mule, and he made this nice little thing that as the mule walked, the little blade would go and it would collect everything on the ground, pick it all up and deposit it right into a cart. So he took his little box and the mule and he went all around, up and down the hills, by rivers, and if he could fit through little groves with it, he would do that. It didn't take too long, not much more than a couple hours before the whole cart was filled. Now it was filled with all sorts of stuff, stones and pebbles and leaves, but it sure had a lot of mushrooms. Will knew it was probably more mushrooms than anyone had ever harvested. So he took that cart and he took it up to King's and knocked on the door. The servant answered, and Will told the servant that he had mushrooms for King, more than King had probably ever seen. So King came to the door and Will showed him the cart. King said, "Will, what am I supposed to do with this? There's all stones and leaves and dirt." And Will said, "No, look, there's mushrooms in here. There's more mushrooms than you've ever seen." And King said, "I can't do anything with this. If I tried sorting through this, it would take me 3 years. There's no way that I can get through these and have all these mushrooms by the time of this dinner party. I can't take this, Will. This isn't any good for me." So Will took the cart and headed back, his head hanging low from defeat. And he told his brother Tom about what had happened, what King said. And Tom, well, he got to thinking too. He thought, well, maybe I can come up with a contraption to sort these. So he went into the kitchen, he got a sieve, and he put everything in there. He was shaking it and got to looking and thinking what stayed and what went through. Well, he went down into town. He bought himself half a dozen sieves of different sizes. And he started putting them in one and collecting what stayed and putting them in another, collecting what went through. And he was sorting out something real interesting there with all that. So after a couple hours of being real clever with these sieves, he had a whole handful of mushrooms, a couple handful of mushrooms. He done it. So he was real excited. So he heads over to King's mansion and knocks on the door. The servant answers and he tells the servant that he has mushrooms for King. So King comes to the door and he looks at these. Now Tom, he thought he did it. He was real clever, real excited. But those mushrooms, they were so bruised and they were all cut up and all dirty and dusty. King says, Tom, what's going on here? These mushrooms are ruined. I can't serve these to my guests. They're all bruised and all cut and split. They don't even look, they're not even edible anymore. Sorry, Tom, but no reward for you. So now Tom heads back all defeated and feeling like he just wasted a whole bunch of time trying to be clever. So they tell Jack, you gotta try. You gotta come up with something now. And Jack, he wasn't too interested in doing that. He certainly didn't consider himself clever enough to create any kind of contraption to do this. He didn't want to, but after a while of pressuring him, Jack decided he'd give it a go. Why not? So he thought he'd head out into the woods a little bit and get to studying. So he's looking around and finding these little mushrooms and picking them and putting them in his pocket, and the whole time thinking, what could he make? What could collect these? What could sort them? How would he do it? How would he get underneath the bramble as he was under there? How would he get by the river as he was walking by the river collecting them? Well, after some time, his eye got real keen to these mushrooms, and he was finding them faster and picking them faster, and he thought his hand kind of looked like his mom's hand when she was stitching up his pants, and well, his mind just started to wander. His mind was wandering all over to this and that and the other. He was just picking them little mushrooms, and time was going by, and before he knew it, the sun was setting. Well, Jack was certainly lost in thought and lost in this thing and didn't want to stop, but pretty soon it became apparent that if he didn't head home now, he'd never find his way home. So he headed home and pretty much gave up. Came back and told Will and Tom he didn't think of anything. He has nothing, sorry, but this isn't, he's going to be no help. Well, Will and Tom, they're listening to Jack, but they're looking at his pockets. Because his pockets, well, they're bulging full. There's mushrooms falling out of his pockets as he walks. The pocket of his pants, and the pocket of his shirt, and every pocket, his back pockets. Everything is full of these little mushrooms. All nice and clean and sorted. So they tell Jack, you gotta go to King and see if you picked more than anyone else. So the next day, Jack heads over to King and knocks on the door. The servant answers, and Jack tells the servant, yeah, I got some mushrooms, maybe if King's interested. So he goes in, and King comes into the room, and Jack starts unloading all of his pockets onto the table. Now King is real surprised. He's shocked. He's never seen this many mushrooms before. He says, Jack, how'd you pick so many mushrooms? And Jack says, well, I don't know. I actually don't remember much. I was kind of just picking and thinking. So Jack got the reward, $1,000. Took it back home to his mom, kind of help out with the homestead. Well, as far as I've heard, they're all doing quite well for themselves.